Thanks everyone for coming along. I will say this was originally prepared as a in-person talk, and I've made some changes, but there was originally quite a lot of audience participation. Obviously that's been cut back a bit. I'll still be doing some audience participation where I'll ask you to turn your mics on because I'll just ask a question. But yeah, turn them back off afterwards. And I'll also ask some questions that might be theoretical, because you won't have done any of those things, but you might have if this was a real in-person talk. And it can be quite interesting to think about that, because I'm sure soon we will return to normality. So I just start this. So the problem is what I'm going to start with is that the problem of climate change. So currently warming the Earth has warmed by 1.2 degrees since pre-industrial levels, and we usually take that to be sort of the 18th century. But I think the most important thing is this is happening not in the abstract future, but within the next 50 years. So the Paris Agreement talks about 1.5 degrees, and 1.5 degrees is still quite a lot of warming. It's realistically the best case we're going to get to now from the point we are by at least this century. But that still causes quite a lot of damage to ecology. It causes massive damage to humans in terms of the amount of food we can have, and particularly in South Asia, how much water is available. As you get onto 2 degrees of warming above pre-industrial levels, you get to really some quite significant losses of crops, 20% of crops being lost, really significant numbers of species dying out, particularly certain ecosystems facing collapse. So ecosystems like the coral reefs, which are of interest to us because we're custodians of the earth, but also because that's where a huge amount of fish comes from and spawns, and a major part of their life cycle happens in coral reefs. And that's likely to leave about 1 billion people short on protein. And then as you get on to 3 and 4 degrees, that's really where you start getting to some pretty big impacts. 40% of food not being able to grow, and you're seeing people really moving around the world in quite a significant way as sea level rise really starts to impact people's lives and drowns significant cities. And by the time you get to 5 and 6 degrees, which is so 3 and 4 degrees, about 3 degrees is where we're currently on target for under the Paris commitments that we're going to be discussing in Glasgow, or the world is going to be discussing in Glasgow in a bit more depth. But as soon as you get to sort of 5 and certainly 6 degrees, you get to a runaway. You get to a point where climate change can't be stopped, and it just gets pervasively worse and worse. So you get massive leaks of methane that cause really a mass extinction, and mass extinction probably means extinction of humans. So the difference between 6 degrees and 0 degrees might sound like a jumper, but actually the difference between 1.5 degrees and 6 degrees is really the existence of life on our planet. So the first thing I was asked to discuss by David was, what's Coventry's carbon footprint? And what you can see from this is actually 40% of what happens in Coventry happens outside of Coventry. 40% of Coventry's carbon footprint happens outside of Coventry. And that's mostly food, but also quite a lot of the consumption, so making things, the things that we use. And I'm going to go through each of these in turn, in terms of how we consider them, but also how we can reduce them, most importantly. And these can be considered in terms of the emissions produced by these activities, as well as how we contribute to that and how we can then reduce that. Yeah. So you can see this, and this will be in the top corner throughout the presentation. But what I think is interesting here is that what happens in our houses, the direct energy use, is a fairly small proportion. And actually, it's the stuff we use, things like food and consumption, that maybe we don't do the emissions or are not direct emissions for us, but very much are related to our actions, and transport as well. Some of that we control with our cars, but a lot of that is indirectly as well, through things like public transport, where we use that. So the big question you all came here to answer is, can technology save us? Well, the answer is somewhat. So it's a more complex answer than yes or no, but the UK government's Committee on Climate Change has done some analysis on this to understand to what extent can technology save us, or can technology help us? And I think what's notable is actually technology gets us 90% of the way there, providing we use it right. And actually a very small proportion comes from behaviour change alone. So that's things like changing our food habits particularly. But the main things are assisted, at least to a major extent, by technology. And as you'll hear, a lot of this exists today and it's competitive. And what's missing is that behaviour change, or behaviour change maybe at an individual level, but often at a more broad level that is responsible for those impacts. So making things, as I've just said, the consumption of our goods has a really significant impact on the environment. The chemical processes in the industrial systems are really hard to decarbonize, because you need to change massive billion-pound infrastructure, and that's really challenging. That takes a long time and it's really expensive. And although a lot of these large technology changes are happening, so there's things like electric arc furnaces that are replacing coal-fired blast furnaces for steel, which is great news, but those things cost billions of pounds and take a really long time, because there's a financial model around them. However, the most powerful thing we can do is to buy and use less, and to implement this waste hierarchy, which I'm sure most of you will have seen. Certainly if you've been to school in the last 30 years, you will have seen it at some point in your education. You might not have remembered it, but it was there. So when you're buying clothes, thinking about, will this get 30 wears? Will we be able to get the number of wears from these clothes? Or am I going to wear it a few times and then probably not wear it again? Things like electronics. Is your current phone basically fine? Can you just upgrade the software? Do you do the recommended maintenance on your washing machine and your fridge and various other things? Because often it's those little bits of ongoing maintenance that means that something lasts for 50 years rather than 5 years. And sharing is another great way to reduce that consumption. So buying things like power tools with your friends and your neighbours. And I wonder if anyone has done that. Can you put your hand up in the Teams function? Do people know how to do that? If you've ever bought tools with friends or neighbours, you can form tool and toy libraries with community groups, and using community centres as the host for those things. And it doesn't need to be super formal. It can be as simple as a shelf with some games on it, and a little sort of sign, basically. But also then there's obviously companies that run hire systems and sharing schemes to allow you to hire stuff rather than buy it. But also you can donate your old stuff. So it's really important to both donate your old stuff to charity shops, but then also buy there so that you can get secondhand stuff. And that's getting that circular economy, getting that reduction in use and that reuse in place. And also the internet's great for that, for getting secondhand items. Then there's the repairs. So it's all about doing it in this order, repairing things to extend their life. So this is some more interactivity. Can you use the raise hand function on Teams for people who can sew a button? Three, 4, 5 people. Okay, put your hands down again. Can you darn a sock? Again, about half of you. Can you change a bicycle tire? Yeah, again, just under half of you this time. And how about a fuse up in a plug? Yeah, still a few of you. Good. So it's really good that some of you can. If you can't, that's fine. But YouTube's a really good opportunity to find out how. But also, even if you can't, and even on the more complex stuff, or things that maybe you can use an expert on, there are loads of skills like cobblers and bike shops and tailors around that aren't that expensive and are much cheaper than buying new stuff. But also there are schemes at colleges and various other places of education, obviously when you're allowed to actually go inside of them, where they have schemes to share their big tools, so things like table saws and that mean that you can use these tools without having to buy your own, or without even having to buy them as a group with friends. And then the last choice, the thing at the bottom of that waste hierarchy, should be to recycle. You shouldn't be recycling as a primary option. And a really important way to improve how much recycling is collected is by preventing contamination. So a really key thing here is tomatoes. Tomatoes, if they get on paper, essentially make that paper impossible to recycle for a variety of reasons. So just when particularly tomatoes in food, clean your cans before you put them in the mixed recycling. But something like plastic and paper, where they don't really get in the way of each other, and once you put that paper in water, it's going to dissolve. Those things are fine to put in together, and that's why you see quite often mixed recycling, particularly at the curbside. But also, there's lots of new technology on recycling. So chemical recycling can turn plastic essentially back to oil, and then back into energy. Back to oil and then turn that oil back into plastic. But that does require a huge amount of energy to do. And actually, one thing we've seen recently is that the recycling in Coventry and Warwickshire is being challenged by the fact that we have these massive waste incinerators, and that too much of our waste is being recovered and burned, basically. And really, we don't want that. We want to be pushing things up the waste hierarchy toward recycling, but and ideally not even to recycling, but so it never hits the waste stream at all. But because they're so big, you have to keep them running. So not building infrastructure in the first place and mothballing infrastructures where we have it is a really important way to limit those impacts from our consumption and the waste in that. No, wrong button. So heat is one of the more difficult things to decarbonize, because basically burning stuff, and particularly burning fossil fuels, is an extremely effective way to make heat, as I'm sure you're all aware. So one part of that is about reducing demand, and this is probably going to become a bit of a theme throughout the talk, is that reducing demand is always the most efficient thing to do. So that means things like insulating houses, making sure buildings and appliances are as efficient as possible. But I recognise that this is expensive, and also if you rent, not very easy at all. So really simple behaviours are key on this. So things like wearing jumpers, which is basically personal insulation, cooking in bulk, and using smart meters and apps and stuff that can help you to only turn on your heating when you need it, because quite often we just put it on a timer and it does its thing. Turn it off when you're out, and monitor the energy that you do use, and then you'll notice yourself reducing. But there's always going to be a demand for heat, and sorry, I'm not usually this bad with the computer. There's always going to be some demand for heat, so we're going to have some technologies that can do that, and there are lots of interesting technologies that allow us to, and this is one where perhaps there's less behavior change in there, but it's still very interesting. A big problem with heat is that it's a very variable demand. So the heat demand in winter is very, very high. The heat demand on the warmest days in summer is pretty close to zero, and that really causes huge issues in terms of storage. If we have electricity providing our heat, we need a huge amount of redundant capacity all year round, basically for that one cold day in December when it's actually needed. So we need something that can be stored, and we need something that is able to be turned on quite quickly, and that allows you to respond to that variability in the supply. The best technology is probably heat pumps at the moment, which concentrate the heat from the air and the soil, and sometimes from water, but usually from the air and the soil. And they're really good for things like space heating, heating your house and heating buildings, because they're good up to about 100 degrees. And if you're wanting more than 100 degrees in your house, you are a salamander, and that's more than enough for home heating. But then you do have some issues with the size of them. So where possible, in places like Coventry, where you've got a load of high density housing, it makes sense to heat more than one house. But also there's a financial model difficulty in that currently we're used to paying for gas. And this would mean you're essentially paying for a temperature rather than paying for an amount of fuel to burn. And that's still something that people have a block around getting over that sort of first step. But for high temperatures and for things like some cooking applications as well, we do still need high temperatures to heat up steel and those sorts of things. And there's really two options there. Biogas replaces fossil gas using plants, basically. So you make gas from plants. And this can be carbon neutral because the plants absorb the same amount of CO2 in their lifetime as they emit when they're burnt. And the other option is hydrogen, which again has some difficulties with it. The challenge with biogas is that it can compete with the food supply, but the difficulty with hydrogen is that whilst in theory you can make it from water using renewable energy, you're more likely at the moment to get it from fossil fuels, and there's almost no infrastructure to make it from water at the moment. There's not very much infrastructure to make it from fossil fuels, and there is a worry that it's being used by the fossil fuel industry to lobby to keep their fossil fuel reserves usable to make hydrogen from them. And that really is a thread that connects a lot of technologies in this financial model, is that there's a lifetime cost of these technologies is already less, and that's great news. So it makes sense to build these technologies from new already because they're cheaper over the lifetime. However, often they have a bigger upfront cost and a lower running cost, which interest exists and those sorts of things. But also there are massive issues with the fact that there are huge incumbent assets already in place. So getting over them is a part of the challenge. But there are some really great financial products out there that already exist, like low carbon bonds, that can work, that are working to essentially expedite this and change the financial model so that it makes sense to build these green technologies earlier, and so that they can make money, and so that those benefits to society and to making money over the short term can be released. And pensions are a really good thing. So you will have a pension probably that you can move from a fossil fuel or a market-based thing and use some of that to invest in green bonds to accelerate the green transition. Obviously speak to a financial advisor about that in more detail. I'm not a financial advisor. But it is a one way you can use your money to expedite the green transition. So as with all these things, reducing emissions from electricity as well is about reducing the amount we use. And as we saw, electricity now makes up just 5%, or domestic electricity, just 5% of our emissions. And that's because it's come down by a huge amount over the last decade, really, just the last decade. And that's because we have phased out coal in favor of renewables, because renewables are cheaper. than building new plants, for one thing. Also, there's regulation around it, but the main reason is renewables are the cheapest way of building electricity capacity, and we can speed that up to an extent. In the UK, it doesn't need much speeding up because we're almost there, by switching to low carbon tariffs, which are also usually cheaper because they don't have to carry the risk of these expensive gas-fired and coal-fired, increasingly phased out coal-fired power stations, and decommissioning those. So we've got the things with electricity of obviously turning off your lights. We all know that if you're not using them. And in particular, turning off consoles and printers. They are huge energy users, even on standby. But with electricity, what we use changes throughout the day, and that changes how much CO2 emissions come with those. So this is what it looks like. This is what our electricity use looks like throughout the day. And much of that evening peak, so you can see there's sort of a daytime amount. It goes less overnight when we're not all awake. And then there's the evening peak. So most of that evening peak is actually gas, or provided by burning gas, and to a lesser extent coal, but almost coal has been disappeared from the UK grid now, so it's pretty much all gas. And though our demand changes, we use those lights in the evening when it's dark, and you'll see this is actually lower in summer when it's less dark in the evenings, and when it's less cold, so we don't need as much heating. But a massive way we can reduce the impact of electricity is by reducing that evening peak, by being smarter with our usage. So putting the washing machine on overnight when it's already very low carbon at very low usage, having our shower in the morning rather than in the evening, or even having a shower less often. If you have to have it in the evening, maybe not have it every evening if possible. But there's also lots of hidden emissions. So streaming is a massive one, and also using your phone, particularly on data. And that's because you've got data centers and phone masts. So a phone mast uses about 95% of the energy in a phone call, and actually only 5% is used by the two handsets. So it's a huge impact comparative to the amount your phone uses if you think you have to charge your phone every day. So turning off your data on your phone when you're at home and you're connected to Wi-Fi is a really good way of doing that, a really good way to reduce the emissions at home, and also downloading stuff at home, or even downloading stuff overnight on Netflix and various other streaming platforms to watch either during the day or to watch when you're out, rather than streaming them off data. Turning your camera off when you're on Teams and Zoom and whatever, it saves it. It's about 2% of the energy to send just your voice as it is to send your voice and your picture. And watching TV together, like it's 2010. Watch TV together as a group rather than individually being in different rooms watching different things. Actually has a massive impact because you're not streaming 3 times the amount, so you're not using 3 times the amount of data center emissions, and usually that's done in the evening. So by doing that together on a large scale, even the scale of a city like Coventry, we can have an impact on that. But as I said, electricity is becoming increasingly low carbon, and as a consequence is being seen as the solution to electrifying lots of things like heat and cars, because those essentially use fuels that you burn directly. So if you can convert them to electricity, you can reduce the impact to a really low level compared to where we are today. And actually those also help with some of this peak issue as well, particularly electric vehicles. So whilst emissions from energy have dropped from transport, while emissions from energy have dropped, we've seen emissions from transport pretty much remained flat over the last decade. And that's not great news. In fact, it's not good news at all. And that's despite cars having improved on an individual level. But the problem is our behaviour's changed. So our behaviour's changed, and we've started moving from our little hatchbacks to our much bigger SUVs, which have a worse impact. But also we've seen public transport being dismantled by austerity over the last decade, and that's meant people use it less. The number of journeys has dropped quite significantly by bus, but also that's partly because the number of routes dropped significantly. People travel less by bus because there are less bus routes. The number of bus routes is, I think, more than halved over the last decade, or maybe it's the number of bus kilometres, but it's one of those two. But it gives you an idea. So this is where my notes say to ask you who drove here today, and how did you get here today? You know, I won't do that, but it might be worth thinking when I show you the graph on the next slide. How can I shift from one mode of transport to a better one? So transport requires a real mixture of service change, of technology change, and of behaviour change. And I think that's where it becomes quite interesting. So the most efficient way of travelling is by bicycle, and particularly around town, because that's where cars in particular, but also motorcycles, are the least efficient, because they're often not moving. And this requires behaviour change, so it requires people to stop seeing their bikes as a leisure activity, but instead see them as a travel activity, even in the rain. And you see this a lot in the Netherlands, you see it in even places like Finland. I was in Oulu, and you see people cycling in -10-degree weather in the snow, and it's just completely normalised. It's great. And actually, it doesn't rain that much. I think that's something we all think, oh, you know, it's going to rain, but I've been cycling for a long time, and you actually don't get wet very much, particularly if you wear a coat. So yeah, not everyone has a bike, so we need things like these bike sharing schemes, and you'll have seen that's meant to be coming to Coventry soon, and they've already started in the university. But also ask the council or set up, if you know, many of you said you've got the skills to change your a bike tyre, show someone else. If everyone, based on the data from this extremely small sample, but quite representative of when I've done this talk before, just teach the person next to you how to fix a bike, and everyone knows how to fix a bike. But the other thing is actually learning to ride a bike. So training adults to ride bikes is really difficult, and helping people to ride bikes is a really good way to reduce their carbon footprint, because for various reasons, often people don't learn as children, and then they have very few opportunities to learn as an adult. So sorry. Cycle infrastructure is the next one. So we need to lobby our council, and to an extent they're doing it. But they're doing it in Coventry to an extent. But the cycle infrastructure in Coventry has been dismantled basically since the 80s. When it was built originally, you can see remnants of it still. There was a cycle ring road, and there were cycle lanes that went out along every single major arterial road. And Coventry, when it was designed in the 60s, had an incredible cycle network that they've essentially largely replaced with car parking. So what they've done in Seville is essentially the opposite. Is they've taken a lot of the roadside parking and the car infrastructure and converted it to be cycle infrastructure at an incredibly low cost. It costs them £20 million to go from 2% of journeys by bike to 30% of journeys by bike. And you compare that with the metro in Birmingham, it's cost them £80 million to do 1.2 kilometres. So cycle infrastructure is by far the cheapest and most convenient way to build infrastructure to get people moving around a city quickly. but also you need secure storage, and those bike loops are the key thing that gets people on bikes. If they can't get to their destination and stop there, they don't use the bikes. And it's those really small things that make all the difference with bike infrastructure, and you really see it with cities that do it well and cities that don't. But there are also cultural taboos around cycling, and quite often that can get missed. For communities who've left poverty for a better life, an SUV is seen as a symbol of success in a way that a bike never will be. Bikes are often thought of as how poor people get to work. And there's lots of cultural taboos around exercising, particularly for women in public, that we need to dismantle. And I don't really know how you do that. It's not a challenge I'm currently working on, but it's something that you can see. There's lots of great initiatives that have done this, but what you don't need to do is tell people that it's good for their health. They know it's good for their health. It's those. There's a number of schemes. There's one in Birmingham particularly, that you start with a group of people who are sort of interested, and then they become ambassadors for a community. Sorry. The next one is public transport. So public transport is hugely expensive to build and run often, particularly in cities where they don't get use, and that's what we're seeing at the moment. So quite often it can be higher carbon, certainly at the moment, because those buses, those huge diesel buses, are running empty. So electrification of those buses, but also things like buses on demand, we're seeing increasingly being used efficiently, and the efficiency of those is so much higher because you know you're going to fill your bus, or at least get a good number of people on it. Whereas if you just have a bus route running to a fixed timetable, it's not necessarily working for the people who use it. But you can then make much better use. And we're seeing in Coventry now that they're electrifying their bus routes to go to zero emission buses. But still, you don't want those things damaging the roads and getting in people's way, basically, if they're not being used. Even car sharing is a great example of that. So think about if you had drove here today, could you have picked people up on your way? And there's some great platforms for that, particularly available on smartphones. And over the next decades, I'm sorry. Oh. There are, you can see platforms to share cars, so we can reduce the number of parked cars. If you look down pretty much any street on any given day, there are still a load of cars parked there. Often as many as half of the cars on a street won't move in an average day. So can we halve the number of cars on that street? Can you share cars with your neighbours or even your family? Quite often you'll see houses with 4 cars parked outside because everyone in the house has a car. It's very, very rare all 4 cars leave the drive, and that then frees up space that can be used for cycle lanes. And almost any street in Coventry that has cars parked all the way down both sides of the road, if you took one of those sides of the road away, that can become a cycle lane very, very quickly, very cheaply. Now, the other big challenge is long distance travel. So I've talked about in the city, but there's really no solution for flying at the moment. There are some synthetic fuels being researched. Rolls-Royce is doing some work on that. And to an extent, high-speed rail can replace domestic aviation. And we're seeing that being deployed very well in Europe with the TGVs and similar high-speed rails networks around Europe. Largely replacing domestic flights in that continent, and in France in particular, there's very, very little domestic aviation. The number of flights between Paris and Marseille, which is much further away than Paris and Edinburgh, there's about half the number of flights between those two cities, which are basically similar in provenance. except obviously much further away because there's a direct TGV that goes pretty much every hour from Palace Orly. So there's not as much need for that domestic flying. But actually, because there's no solution for long haul flying, we need those solutions to be behavioral. So flying less. If you want to go on holiday to New Zealand, consider Ireland or Scotland. They're both lovely. If you want to talk to someone for a business meeting, you know, COVID has shown that you can basically do everything on Teams or on Zoom. Use that. It's you know, pretty much as good for most activities, particularly if it's only a short trip. But for diaspora communities, that's not an option. The first time I gave this talk, I was meant to be giving it with someone else from India, but they had to fly home at very short notice because they still have commitments in India. You know, their mum was ill, they had to go, and by us who maybe don't need to fly, not using that space, people who do need to fly can have the opportunity to fly because when it's needed, there is still the emissions budget for people who need to fly to fly. I hope that was clear. So the last part of our diet is, sorry, I've given that away. The last part of our carbon footprint is our diet, and it's the biggest one, as I showed in that first graph. So I'm going to start with a question. So this is the bit where I'm going to ask you to unmute your mics. So what did you have for dinner last night? Oh no, I'm not. Can you use the hand function again? So who had chicken? Okay, one person. Who had a vegetarian meal? Okay, 3 people. Who had 4 people? Who had a meal with beef in it? And if you've not responded, what did you have for dinner last night that I've missed off this list?
I eat vegan, so I had a stir fry with brown rice pasta.
Okay.
Fish.
Fish, there we are. Okay. Thanks very much. Can you all please go on mute again? So yeah, the biggest thing you can do for your diet is to eat less meat, and particularly red meat. Red meat is about 10 times the impact that chicken or fish is. It depends on the fish. There's a bigger difference with fish. And about 100 times worse than soya. So chicken and fish are about 10 times worse than a vegan or vegetarian meal in general. So there's obviously exemptions, and I'll go on to them in a minute, but there's lots of differences within each of those. But in general, red meat is about 100 times as bad as a vegetarian meal, and chicken or fish is about 10 times as bad. Which, when you sort of think of that, is really quite significant. You can eat 100 meals, vegetarian meals, for roughly the same impact as you can for one steak meal. Well, even more than that. So you can see from this, a vegan and vegetarian diet are much lower carbon than equivalent meat diets. And actually, one thing that's quite interesting here, this is from some work I was involved in to understand the impact of different people's diets based on how they eat. And actually, one thing you note here is that often people who eat halal and kosher meals have more vegetarian meals because they can't find halal and kosher foods as easily. But actually, you see people who have no dairy in their meal tend to replace a lot of the dairy products with meat, which is why they're so high impact. And often the same with pescatarians is pescatarians actually don't eat fish that much. So they're sort of vegetarians with maybe once or twice a week they eat fish. which was quite interesting from research I was involved in. But yes, this is where technology comes in. So vegan food is quite nice, but meat is also delicious, and cheese in particular is delicious. But the technology is coming to the rescue in that we're seeing increasingly developed really good alternatives. If you were a vegan in the 80s, you will remember that there wasn't a great deal of choice. Even in the early 2000s, there wasn't a great deal of choice. But even in the last couple of years, you've seen the development of aisles in the supermarket full of this. And you don't have to necessarily give up meat, but that behavioral shift from eating meat every day or even with every meal to even having meat once a week or a couple of times a week, where you would have had it multiple times a week, and moving in vegetarian food, or replacing, when you're cooking, replacing cow's milk with soya milk or something, can have quite an impact that builds up and can save a huge amount of CO2. This is one of the areas where you can make the choice to change quite quickly and make a very significant impact. A vegan diet here is a really significantly reduced impact, but you don't necessarily need to go to a vegan diet. But even by reducing a few bits of meat on this, you can see the difference between that no dairy, we'll call that a high meat eating diet, to a halal or kosher diet where there's less meat eaten and more vegetarian meals, as I said earlier. That has a huge impact, almost half the impact. But another really important point in this is eating more seasonally has a huge impact. And you don't need to eat like a monk, but you do need to prevent air freight. So air freight is incredibly impactful. In general, transport's not a big part of the diet, but air freight is. And there aren't that many things that are air freighted. So outside of season, things like berries, asparagus, morage too, fine beans, they're air freighted. So if you see things that, they're often well packaged, things that are perishable, that come from a long way away, where they're grown outside in season there, but actually they're not in season in the UK. If you can't see them from anywhere near the UK, they're probably out of season. And really, these can be 30 to 50 times the impact of what they are in season. So you have them in season by all means, but out of season, they're just terrible. And really, this is one of the few bits where probably we're just going to stop doing this. It's probably never going to be part of a future green economy. But it's not just the food miles. It's often better to grow things in the right climate outdoors rather than put them on a ship. And a ship's the important bit there. And things like bananas and tomatoes and oranges that are grown in Spain or even in West Africa and the Caribbean, that are grown outdoors are much better than growing them in heated greenhouses in the UK, but actually often even better than growing them in season in the UK and storing them. So at this time of year, actually, bananas are probably lower carbon, well, in fact, definitely lower carbon. They're not apples that have been stored in a chiller for 6 months. Even if those apples were grown in the UK. And actually, something like bananas and tomatoes and oranges that are grown in the right place and put on a ship are by far, yeah, they're absolutely fine, basically. But the last thing I'm going to talk about is food waste, before I sort of summarize and hopefully have 5 minutes of questions. In the UK, we don't eat 30% of our edible food. And some of this is in the supply chain, but most of it is behavior change. So it's things like planning meals and portion control, not just buying the same stuff every week, actually thinking, am I going to use this? And if you're not great at portion control, eating those leftovers, don't make enough for 3 people, make enough for 4 people, and then you've got 2 dinners. And one evening where you don't really have to think about cooking. It's great. But also, so eating as much as possible off the animal or the vegetable. So not just eating the breasts on a chicken, having like chicken thighs and a whole chicken, or having the florets, not just the florets on a broccoli, but having the big bit in the middle as well, which is perfectly edible and fine, but also reducing the aesthetic standards. So when you see wonky veg in the supermarket, buy it. It's fine. It tastes the same. And then people will be like, oh, cool. People are fine with buying a weirdly bent carrot. They don't all have to be dead straight. And then only where you don't eat it, composting what's left over in your garden and making sure that compost doesn't become a source of methane. So making sure there's plenty of air in there, basically. Don't let the compost heap sit there for too long, and otherwise you'll start producing methane from that compost. And that's a greenhouse gas that is very bad for the environment. So yeah, some of the things I've spoken about today require a bit of time, maybe a bit of money, a bit of work. But really, the one thing about food is that everyone is going to go home and, I mean, you're already at home, but it's going to remain at home and eat something tonight. And you can put that into action from today. You can certainly put it into action from tomorrow if you already had your tea. I think that's the most exciting thing for me with food, is that all of this you can put into action tomorrow. So yeah, just to summarize, sorry, it's not moved on. Just to summarize, technology can help us, but we really need behavior change to do to get to net zero together. And that means from consumption, putting the waste hierarchy into action. It's a hierarchy for a reason. You reduce first and you recover only as the last resort. On heat and electricity, consider when you're using your energy. Can you use it at a better time of day? Can you ideally do it overnight if you don't need to be next to the thing? Or can you use less of it? That's really the theme for everything. Can you use less of it? And then for transport, can you travel less if possible? And where you can't travel less, use the most efficient transport method. Listen to Norman Tebbit, get on your bike. That's an old reference, sorry. But again, with diet, cut down on meat, cut down on waste, and cut out air freighted food. Really, there's no excuse for air freighted food. So I'll leave you with these last comments. This was originally done for some students, but you can do the same as adults. Do as much of the behavior change as possible, but also be an activist. Teach your family and your friends and elected officials and business leaders. They're just people. And speak the truth to them. Speak truth to power. And tell them the change you want. But don't just depress them. Make sure there's plenty of hope. No one takes action because they're shouted at. They take action because they're told what to do and they feel like they can do it. And then the last thing is get involved. You've all got careers and those are part of it. But outside of those, you can still take action to seize on the opportunity and do what you can to further this. So yeah, thanks very much. Do you have any questions?
I'm just unmuting everybody, so if you want to unmute yourself, you can ask a question. There is one question in the chat box at the moment, asking if you're gluten-free, is the carbon footprint of gluten-free grains worse?
It depends. Wheat is super efficient because it's produced in huge volumes, but realistically it doesn't make a difference. Like, you're talking about small differences. Don't give yourself an issue. Grains are low impact. Grains in general are almost the lowest impact thing. So don't worry about the carbon impact of your grains. Have one less piece of cheese a month probably, and it will offset the impact of it, any additional impact of those grains. But even so, it's probably not that much of an issue. I can only think oats are basically similar. Spelt is, yeah, they're all similar. There's none that are very different at all. Any other questions?
I have a question. I live in the US. I'm in Arizona, outside of Phoenix, and it's very hot here. And so heating is not a concern, but cooling is. And so my question is, which one would have less impact, environmental impact? Planting grass around my house here and doing a sprinkler system, which would use a lot of water in terms of, city water use, in order to decrease my electric use, because having grass decreases the air temperature around the house, which would decrease our electric usage and heating, cooling cost in the summer. So which one do you think is a better option? Leaving it as is and not doing water, or doing the landscaping and using more water resource but decreasing electric use?
Can I do a third?
Yeah.
Potentially getting some nice shrubs that, rather than grass. Grass clearly doesn't do well in that climate.
Okay.
So if you can get some shrubs that are maybe more water tolerant and have deeper roots, it might be better. They will also reduce the heat. They'll give you a bit of shade as well. Yeah.
Okay. Doing that along like the perimeter of the house.
Yeah. Another thing, heat pumps. Heat pumps are really good actually, and increasingly in the UK are good for us in terms of they give you heat in winter, but they also give you cooling. Because in essence, what they tap into is the soil, and the soil's always at about 16 degrees. So even in somewhere like Arizona, a heat pump is good because it's like an air conditioning system in reverse, basically. It takes heat from the ground, or cold, as it is in Arizona where it's 30 degrees. It takes that and sort of puts heat back into the soil and extracts the cold from the roughly 15-degree temperature, which is basically what you want your house to be, back into the house. So consider looking at a heat pump.
All right. Thank you.
I'm just going to throw this one in there, Tom. Would insulation be of any use?
Yes, good point. Yeah, it's an American house, so it's probably poorly insulated.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, go on.
What about expanding tree cover?
I didn't include that in here because it's a complex answer, and most people can't do it very easily.
Why is it complex?
It's complex. Could someone turn their microphone off, please? Yeah, tree cover is complicated because it depends on the tree a bit. In general, more trees is better. It gives you more shade. Yeah, okay, it's not that complicated. More trees is usually better. It depends on the application. It depends on what tree. It depends how you plant it. Take a bit of professional advice when planting a tree. But otherwise, more trees is better.
Excellent. Thanks. Oh, another one. What about this thing about green walls? I've read about using ivy to grow walls, actually lowers temperature as well, and
so that's similar to what they were saying just now about planting grass around the house. Planting any plants around the house, they absorb. They transpire. They essentially emit water into the air as they breathe out, basically.
Yeah.
And that cools the house down. So a green wall does the same thing. It just does it close to the house.
Right. Okay.
But it can, particularly if the house is not built for it, which most houses aren't, a green wall is a good thing if you're building a new house. A green wall isn't a great thing on most existing houses because they tend to damage the house.
Can I also ask about using disused mines as a source of energy? Because that was an idea that was floated by Brett Willers in a presentation he did, and I'm just wondering, is that a viable thing for Coventry to use some of the disused mines?
For heat, potentially.
Yeah.
Not for coal. Yeah.
Yes.
Not for coal. Don't do that. That's bad.
As a heat source.
But yeah, I mean, there's essentially all a mine is a big hole, a deep hole. So as you get closer to the center of the earth, it gets hotter, and a deep heat pump is potentially going to get more heat, but also you've got a huge amount of infrastructure in terms of then distributing the heat. And we've seen from the district heating network so there's a district heating network connected to the waste to energy plant that goes around the city, and distributing that heat has not necessarily been done in the most effective way, because they've distributed the heat to houses that are sorry, not to houses, but to civic buildings rather than to the houses. So that installation is next to some of the poorest areas of Coventry, and they get no benefit from it. So if you're going to use a mine and help the people near it rather than sending it to a piping heat is very inefficient. The further you send heat, it's very, very inefficient over even quite short distances.
Yeah.
So it works if we can do it next to that, but I would say it's probably not going to be that much more efficient than if we just put a heat pump in the garden and dug a hole that was like 2 meters deep, and then use that heat pump to heat the 3 houses around it, or 4 houses, or however many houses it could heat. So it's probably one of those. It's probably, if we're honest, one of those big boys' toys that the council love, that potentially are a lovely thing to cut a ribbon on, but actually, have they spent that money on 20, a number of heat pumps that are maybe less impressive, but better and cheaper, they could have done a much more effective job at a lower price, and that's done it for more people or places.
Right. Thanks.
I'm conscious that we're at the end of our hour. Are there any last questions? And then I'll say.
Can I ask just a question about the materials recycling facility that they've just approved? Have you got a view on that, and the fact that it's a regional facility and it will bring traffic from all over the West Midlands to a B road in Coventry to deliver recyclates? Is that good, or is it bad?
I mean, it might not be great for the people who live there, but in general, it's probably going to have a net benefit. The recycling rate is generally poor because of lack of facility, and the reason we have a lack of facility is because we have a lack of joined up supply. Because in essence, the waste is run by every single district council, and they run it differently because UK local government is kind of dumb. And realistically, to make one of these recycling facilities work, you need scale, and you need the scale of probably 2 to 5 million people, depending on what you're recycling. Maybe not quite 2 million, maybe slightly less than that, maybe 500,000 to 2. It depends what you're recycling, basically. So to recycle really effectively, you probably need between 2 and 5 million people, and almost no district councils. I think only Birmingham has a district council that big. So it makes sense to be bringing waste from outside of Coventry, sorting it well, and then you can recycle it well. So I would suggest it probably has a quite significant net benefit. But I imagine it is also going to be quite annoying for the people who live around it.
Yeah, we were expecting 26-ton Arctics on our roads locally, so we're not terribly chuffed. I think
No.
it would have been better outside the city, away from residential areas, but that
Almost definitely.
doesn't seem to have been considered. Thank you.
But also something like the benefit of it is most of that waste would have previously gone up the chimney at the Whitley waste disposal incinerator, basically. And then it would have produced a lot of air pollution that would have been thrown over the city, particularly some of the poorest areas of the city. And that's not good either. So it's good that it's preventing a lot of, I mean, that's CO2, but also air pollution as well. And perhaps a more pressing issue is the air pollution in that case. Are there any other questions?
Hi, so I have a question about kind of what things will look like after COVID. So a lot of companies are saying that they'll let people continue to work from home. Do you think that will actually be in some sense worse because more houses will have to be heated and stuff during the day compared to everyone being in one office building, or do you still think it will be better?
I would be really interested to know that. I've not done the maths, and I've not read a good study that has yet. It's really hard to work that out. But one thing I am aware of is that we have not seen any real particular change in the grid and the level of grid consumption, which suggests, at least at a high level, that it's probably not going to have a huge impact. I guess it's where do you draw the boundaries, and where you draw the boundary is probably going to give the answer to the study differently, which is why the studies I've seen are dubious, because there's the impact of the transport and the fact that you're not using transport. Measuring that is fairly difficult. The fact that all the transport that is still moving is moving more freely because there's less congestion. There's the issue that, depending on the size of the building, is if everyone's going from their houses, which largely they have to heat, to their offices, which largely, if they're big, have to be cooled, because as soon as you get 30 people in a room, usually they produce enough heat that you have to cool the building rather than heat it. So it depends. It depends. It's a seasonal thing as well. So offices are probably more efficient in winter when everyone's heating their homes and their offices don't need as much cooling, but probably more efficient in summer when everyone doesn't have to heat their home and does have to cool their office. Is probably the truth of the answer. But saying work from home more in summer and less in winter is probably not going to happen, but actually it's probably the best outcome. But yeah, part of it also depends on how good the houses are. So it depends where the study is done. In Britain, we have a lot of old houses. Potentially, we could and should be doing lots of retrofit on those houses, and I know certainly Liam Byrne in the West Midlands is looking at a big retrofit program in terms of getting house, because there's a lot of drafty old houses in the UK. So a really large study of the UK would be really interesting. I've not even seen if that's going to happen at the moment. I would love it to happen, but broadly speaking, I think this is probably the perfect opportunity to do it. But broadly speaking, I would say, yeah, it depends on the year, and I've not seen any conclusive evidence either way.
Cool, thanks.
Okay, well, thank you all for your time. Thanks for coming. I will probably wrap it up there and have a lovely evening.